The candle had already drowned in its own wax by the time Cecily Vane realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had counted the doors. She was certain of it. Third on the left, down the long corridor of Thornmere Hall, past the portrait of the sour-faced admiral and the table with the cracked leg. She had made that walk every night for 3 weeks. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, steady, unremarkable, hers. But the man asleep in the bed was not her husband. She knew it the moment the dying ember in the grate threw its last light across the room. The shoulders were wrong, too broad, too still, carrying even in sleep the particular stillness of a man accustomed to commanding silence from the world around him. The dark hair against the white pillow was wrong. The ring on the hand resting above the coverlet was wrong. No thin gold band, but a heavy signet, old and severe. She should have left. She would have left, had the floorboard not confessed beneath her foot with a groan loud enough to wake the dead. The man in the bed woke instead. He did not startle. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply turned his head with the slow, deliberate certainty of someone who had never once been surprised by anything the world placed before him, and looked at her. In the fractured dark, Cecily could make out very little. A jaw set hard as quarried stone, eyes that caught the last of the firelight and gave nothing back. And then the click. Soft, precise, irreversible. The key turned from the inside. "You," said the Duke of Raleigh, his voice carrying the particular quietness of a man who had no need to raise it, "are not the woman I was expecting." The worst of it, the part that would keep Cecily awake for weeks afterward, replaying itself against the inside of her skull, was not the locked door. It was that he did not sound displeased. The key did not move. Cecily stood 6 feet from the door. She had counted, the way one counts things when panic must be kept on a leash, and watched the Duke of Raleigh watch her. He had not risen from the bed. He had not needed to. The room was his, the dark was his, and the locked door was simply a punctuation mark on a sentence he had not yet finished writing. "I counted the doors," she said. Her voice, to its credit, did not tremble. "I made an error." "You did," he agreed. He studied her the way a man studies something unexpected dropped into his palm, not with alarm, but with the slow, measuring attention of someone deciding its worth. Cecily became acutely aware of her appearance. Her dark hair was loose, her wrap thin, her feet bare against the cold floor. She was, in every visible sense, a woman who had dressed for a man's room. Just not this man's. "My name is Cecily Vane," she said, because it seemed important that he know she was not nobody. "I am a guest of Lord Whitmore's. My husband—" "I know who your husband is." Something in the way he said it, flat, almost bored, but with a precision that suggested he had chosen boredom deliberately, made her go still. "Then you understand this is a misunderstanding," she said. "Unlock the door." He tilted his head. The firelight had died completely now, and he was little more than a silhouette, vast and unhurried. "In a moment," he said. "First, tell me why a woman visiting her husband at this hour looks as though she would rather be anywhere else on earth." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, crammed with everything Cecily had spent 3 weeks refusing to say aloud. She did not answer him. That was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. The Duke rose from the bed. He moved without theatrics, no slow, predatory unfolding designed to intimidate. He simply stood, reached for the dark robe draped across the chair beside him, and pulled it on with the ease of a man entirely comfortable inside his own skin. Cecily looked away. It was a reflex, not modesty, and she suspected he noted the distinction. He crossed to the fireplace, crouched, and coaxed the embers back to life with a patience that felt almost insulting given the circumstances. "Sit," he said. "I would rather stand." "I imagine you would." He did not look up. "Sit, anyway." She sat. Not because he told her to, she told herself this very firmly, but because her legs had decided, independently of her pride, that they had endured enough. His name was Edmund Carew, Duke of Raleigh. She knew him by reputation the way one knows a country one has never visited, through other people's accounts, filtered and unreliable, cold, brilliant, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, the sort of man drawing rooms discussed in hushed voices when he was absent and fell silent around when he was present. He handed her a glass. She looked at it. "Brandy," he said, "not poison." She drank. It burned cleanly, and she was grateful for it. "You said," she began carefully, "that you know who my husband is." "Viscount Vane." He settled into the chair across from her. "Yes." "Then you know we are here at Lord Whitmore's invitation. There is nothing suspicious in my presence at Thornmere Hall." "I didn't say there was." His gaze was direct without being aggressive, the gaze of a man who had long since stopped pretending he wasn't paying attention. "That has nothing to do with being here. That is about going to him." The fire crackled between them. Cecily set down the glass before her hand could betray her. She left before the house woke. Edmund did not stop her. He crossed to the door, turned the key, that single, unhurried motion, and stepped back. No parting words designed to wound or to charm, only his eyes, which followed her into the corridor with an attention she felt between her shoulder blades long after she had turned the corner. She found her own room, her own cold bed, and lay in it, staring at the ceiling until gray light crept beneath the curtains. Sleep did not come. In its place came the memory of his voice, not its tone, but its precision, the way he had named her husband, and then waited, as though he already knew what her silence would confess. Viscount Vane was asleep when Cecily passed his door. She could hear it, the slow, indifferent rhythm of a man with an entirely clean conscience. It had been 6 weeks since he had last spoken to her, beyond the requirements of public performance. 8 since he had looked at her as though she were a person rather than a fixture of his household, present, serviceable, and easy to ignore. She had come to Thornmere Hall because he had asked her to. He needed her there, he said, needed the appearance of a united marriage, for reasons he did not explain and she had stopped asking about. She had agreed because it cost less than fighting, and because some part of her, the part she kept in a small locked room inside herself, still hoped. She was beginning to find that hope exhausting. At breakfast, Edmund Carew sat 3 seats down from her on the opposite side of the long table. He did not look at her once. He spoke to Lord Whitmore about drainage of all things, his attention apparently absorbed entirely by the subject of the East Field. But when she reached for the salt, his hand was already there, and he passed it to her without looking up, as though he had simply known she would need it. She did not thank him. She was not sure she could afford to. Lord Whitmore's estate ran to a library that smelled of cedar and undisturbed time, and Cecily retreated to it that afternoon the way an animal retreats to water, not for pleasure, but for survival. She had barely opened the book in her lap before she heard the door. Edmund did not announce himself. He entered with the same unhurried assurance he seemed to carry everywhere, scanned the room once, and selected a chair by the far window that was, she noticed, angled so that he could see both her and the door. An old habit, she suspected, the kind formed not from paranoia, but from long practice of never being caught unprepared. For a quarter of an hour, neither of them spoke. The library absorbed the silence and held it comfortably. "The woman you were expecting," Cecily said at last, without looking up from her book. "Was she a guest here?" A pause. Not the pause of a man caught off guard, the pause of a man deciding how much truth to spend. "She was," he said. "And does she have a name?" "Several, I imagine. The one she uses here is Mrs. Harlow." Cecily turned a page she had not read. "Is she beautiful?" "That is not what she is," Edmund said, and something in his tone made Cecily finally look up. His expression had not changed. It rarely seemed to, but there was a tightness around his eyes, faint as a hairline fracture in fine porcelain. "Then what is she?" He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light lay across the room in flat, honest slabs, and there was nowhere to hide inside it. "She is the reason," he said quietly, "that I came to Thornmere Hall at all." He returned to his book. Cecily stared at hers and read nothing, because her mind was entirely occupied with the expression he had worn for that one unguarded moment. Not cold, not composed, but the face of a man carrying something that had grown heavier than he had originally agreed to bear. Mrs. Harlow arrived that evening. Cecily heard her before she saw her. Laughter in the entrance hall, low and practiced, the kind of laughter that knew exactly what it was doing. She appeared at dinner in amber silk, dark-haired and striking, with the particular confidence of a woman who had learned early that a room reorganized itself around her without her having to ask. She was also, Cecily realized, with a cold and clarifying shock, on her husband's arm. Not Edmund's, Vane's. The Viscount guided Mrs. Harlow to her seat with an attentiveness Cecily had not seen him direct at anything in months. He pulled out her chair. He leaned close when she spoke. Twice Cecily watched his hand rest briefly at the small of the woman's back, a gesture so practiced and so private that it could only mean one thing. It was not new. That was the part that hollowed her out most cleanly. Not the betrayal itself, which she had suspected in the abstract, the way one suspects bad weather, but the evidence that it had been going on long enough to become comfortable, long enough for a hand to settle at a back without hesitation. She ate her soup. She answered Lord Whitmore's question about Bath. She did not look at her husband. Across the table, Edmund was looking at her. Not obviously, he was too disciplined for that, but she caught it once, a glance that lasted precisely a beat too long to be accidental. In it was something she could not immediately name. Not pity, she would have recoiled from pity. Something closer to recognition, the expression of a man watching someone absorb a blow he had already absorbed himself a long time ago. She looked away first. Later, lying in the correct bedroom, her own this time, certainly, she understood what he had meant in the library. "She is the reason I came to Thornmere Hall at all." He had not come for Mrs. Harlow. He had come because of her. She found him on the east terrace before sunrise. She had not planned to. She had not planned anything beyond escaping the four walls of a room that had begun to feel like a verdict. But there he was, standing at the stone balustrade with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking out at a parkland still wrapped in blue-gray mist, as though the landscape owed him an answer. He did not turn when she approached. He said, "You could not sleep either." It was not a question. "How long have you known?" she asked. She did not need to specify. He was not a man who required things spelled out. A long silence. The mist moved slowly across the lawn below them, unhurried and indifferent. "Long enough," he said, "that coming here was not impulsive." She gripped the balustrade. The stone was cold and rough beneath her palms, and she was grateful for it. Something real, something that pushed back. "He brought her here," she said, "to the same house, with me present." She heard her own voice, steady, almost conversational, and found it faintly remarkable. "That is not carelessness, that is a message." "Yes," Edmund said, simply, without softening it. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" She turned to look at him then, fully, in the bleak, honest light of early morning, where there was no firelight to complicate things. He set down the cup. He turned to face her. And the answer he gave her, quiet, deliberate, and entirely without the protections men like him usually kept assembled, cracked something open between them that neither of them would be able to close again. He said, "Because someone needed to be." She did not see Edmund for the rest of that day. He was present at luncheon. She heard his voice through the drawing-room door, measured and unhurried, as always, but by the time she entered, he had gone. She told herself it did not matter. She had more pressing things to occupy her mind than the whereabouts of a duke who had said 4 words on a terrace and then apparently vanished into the Lincolnshire mist. Because someone needed to be. She turned it over as she walked the grounds alone that afternoon, the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was something more unsettling than either. It was a man telling the truth at the precise moment he had no reason to. Vane did not seek her out. Mrs. Harlow drifted through the afternoon like smoke, appearing in doorways, laughing in corridors, occupying the spaces Cecily moved through with a proprietorial ease that made Cecily's jaw ache from the effort of keeping it unclenched. That evening she went to Lord Whitmore's study on the pretense of borrowing a map of the estate. She did not want the map. She wanted the writing desk in the corner, specifically the drawer she had noticed Lord Whitmore leave unlocked when he rose to greet a guest that morning. Inside was nothing remarkable. Correspondence, a bill of sale, an invitation to a hunt, and beneath those a folded letter, sealed with a crest she did not recognize, addressed in a hand she did not know, to a name that stopped her cold. For the attention of Mrs. R. Harlow, care of Viscount Vane. Not Lord Whitmore's address, Vane's, his London townhouse. She was not supposed to know that Mrs. Harlow's letters were being routed through her husband's address. She replaced everything precisely as she had found it, walked calmly back to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that felt very much like fury. Then she began to think. She went to Edmund, not in the dark this time, not down the wrong corridor with a guttering candle. In broad daylight, in the east wing where Lord Whitmore had housed him, she knocked on his sitting-room door at 4 in the afternoon like a woman with nothing to hide, because she had decided that hiding things was a luxury she could no longer afford. He opened the door himself. No valet, no performance. He looked at her face and stepped back to let her in. Mrs. Harlowe's correspondence is being routed through my husband's London address, she said, before she had even fully crossed the threshold. She is not simply his mistress, is she? Edmund closed the door. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man watching a fire he had been carefully tending finally catch.
"No," he said, "she is not." "Then tell me what she is." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him make the decision, saw it move across his face the way weather moves across open country, visible and deliberate. "Sit down, Mrs. Vane." "I am tired," she said evenly, "of being asked to sit down." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite amusement, but the shadow of it. "Then stand." He moved to the window. 3 years ago, my younger brother made a series of investments through a financial agent who came to him with impeccable references and a persuasive manner. The investments failed, not through misfortune, through design. The agent had structured the whole arrangement to collapse at a predetermined point, transferring the assets quietly to a third party before the dust settled. Cecily felt the shape of it before he finished. "The agent," she said, "was operating under instruction." He turned from the window. "From your husband." The room was very still. "My brother lost everything," Edmund said, "and then he lost considerably more than that." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The weight of those words, considerably more than that, settled over Cecily like a stone dropped into still water, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had not simply married a cold and faithless man. She had married a dangerous one. She did not weep. She noted this about herself with a kind of distant curiosity, that the revelation which should have undone her had instead produced in her something closer to bedrock, solid, immovable, cold in the way that is useful rather than merely painful. "What happened to your brother?" she asked. Edmund's jaw tightened. "He died. 8 months after the investments collapsed. He took a fever that a man in better circumstances, with better lodgings, with adequate coal, with a physician who wasn't a last resort, would likely have survived." He paused. He was 24. The quiet between them was different now. Not the quiet of two strangers navigating proximity, but the quiet of two people who have looked at the same wound from opposite sides and finally turned to face each other across it. "Mrs. Harlowe," Cecily said carefully, "was the agent's associate." "His courier, his alibi. And now, it appears, she has transferred her particular talents to your husband's continued service." He looked at her directly. "The letter you found, if it followed the pattern of the others I have been tracking, likely contains details of another arrangement, another carefully constructed collapse, another family that will not see it coming." "You have been collecting evidence." "For 2 years." "And you followed her here?" "I followed him here," Edmund said. "She was simply confirmation that I had the right gathering." Cecily walked to the window he had vacated and stood where he had stood, looking out at the same grey parkland. She thought about the man sleeping soundly in the room 3 doors from hers, the man who had offered her his name, his household, his cold and measured attention, and had apparently been using the cover of a respectable marriage the entire time to conduct something that had cost a young man his life. "What do you need?" she asked. Edmund was silent. She turned.
You came here with a plan. You have evidence, or the beginning of it. What do you still need?" He studied her for a long moment, measuring, she thought, not her trustworthiness, but her steadiness, whether she would hold the weight of what came next. "The letter," he said at last, "and one more night." She retrieved the letter that evening. It required nothing dramatic, only patience, a clear head, and the particular invisibility that women in unhappy marriages develop like a second skin. She knew how to move through a room without being the most interesting thing in it. She knew how to be present without being noticed. She had been practicing that particular skill for 3 years without understanding, until now, that it might one day be useful for something beyond simple self-preservation. She passed the letter to Edmund in the library, their hands not quite touching, the exchange lasting less than 3 seconds. He read it. His expression did not change, but she saw his hand still against the page, one brief cessation of movement, like a clock pausing between ticks. "It is enough," he said quietly. "Combined with what I already hold, it is enough." What followed was not romantic. It was not the stuff of drawing-room whispers or breathless ballroom gossip. It was a man and a woman sitting across from each other by a fire, methodically dismantling a plan that had taken 2 years to assemble, reviewing what could be proven and by whom, deciding the order in which things must happen to prevent Vane from realizing what was coming before it arrived. They worked until the fire burned low. At some point, Edmund rose to add coal, and when he returned, he sat not in the chair across from her, but in the one beside her, angled toward the same documents, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the steadiness of his breathing. She did not move away. Neither did he. "When this is over," she said, at a point when they had covered everything practical, and the silence had turned from purposeful to something softer and more uncertain, "what do you intend to do?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "That," he said, "depends considerably on what you intend to do." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had not yet permitted herself, in the full honest light of a dying fire, with no social performance required of either of them. He looked back, no artifice, no armor, just a man who had carried something alone for 2 years and had not, until 72 hours ago, considered the possibility of putting it down. "Then we will have to survive tomorrow first," she said. He nodded once. Yes. It unraveled at breakfast. Not through any dramatic confrontation, through a footman delivering a note to Edmund at the table, the contents of which caused him to set down his coffee with a quietness so deliberate that Cecily, seated 4 places away, felt it like a change in air pressure. Vane had found the letter missing from the study. It took less than an hour for the whole thing to collapse forward. Edmund presented his evidence to Lord Whitmore in the study. Cecily was not present for that, but she heard the voices through the door, Whitmore's escalating sharply, Vane's dropping to something quiet and dangerous in the way that things become quiet just before they break. Mrs. Harlow was gone by noon, her departure so swift it left only a scent of amber and the memory of practiced laughter. The confrontation between Cecily and her husband happened in the garden, because neither of them had planned it, and gardens do not offer the dignity of 4 walls. Vane looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not guilt, not even anger, but the specific cold calculation of a man deciding how much damage he could yet manage. "You had no right." "I had every right," she said. Her voice did not shake. It had decided, apparently, that it was done shaking over him. "You used me. You used my name, my presence, my—" She stopped, steadied, continued, my willingness to believe that a cold husband was simply a private man. You let me think there was something worth waiting for. He said nothing. Your brother, said Edmund's voice from behind her. She had not heard him approach. Vane's eyes moved to him, and in them she saw it, the first real crack in his composure, genuine fear arriving 2 years late. The boy's name was Thomas, said Edmund. He was not loud, he did not need to be. He walked forward until he stood beside Cecily, shoulder to shoulder, and the simple geometry of it, the two of them, together, facing the man who had wronged them each in different but equally deliberate ways, said more than any prepared speech. He was kind, and he was trusting, and he believed the paperwork you put in front of him, because it came with an honest face. I want you to remember his name. I want it to be the last thing you think of when you consider what comes next. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cecily had ever stood inside. Vane looked at her once more, a last attempt, she thought, to find something in her face that would give him purchase, some remnant of the woman who had waited and endured and kept hoping. He found nothing. She had taken it with her when she left. The legal separation was handled by Edmund's solicitor, quietly and with the swift efficiency of someone who had been briefed thoroughly and paid accordingly. Vane did not contest it. He was in no position to contest anything. The evidence Edmund had assembled, 2 years of it, meticulous as cartography, was placed before the appropriate authorities. The outcome was not swift, as these things never were, but it was inevitable, in the way of all carefully built structures designed to hold weight. Vane's name was removed from polite society the way a stain is removed from good linen, with effort, without ceremony, and with the clear intention that the fabric should afterwards be used again. Mrs. Harlow was not seen again in London. Cecily spent the winter in Bath, in a rented house with 2 adequate fireplaces and a garden that would be lovely in spring. She wrote letters. She read without pretending to. She slept through entire mornings for the first time in 3 years, and woke without that particular tightness in the chest that comes from lying beside someone who makes you feel more alone than solitude ever could. Edmund came in February. He did not arrive with declarations. He arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced, in the middle of a rainstorm, and stood in her small hallway, looking considerably less composed than she had ever seen him, his coat wet, his hair disordered, carrying the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and then discarded it at the gate. I have been patient, he said, for what I consider a reasonable interval. Cecily looked at him, at the wet coat and the dishevelled hair and the eyes that held, as they always had, that quality of total attention, the sense that the world had narrowed to precisely the dimensions of the room she was in. "Come in," she said. "You are dripping on my floor." He came in. Later, when the fire was high and the rain had settled into something gentler against the windows, she thought about locked doors, how a door locked from the inside by the wrong man in the wrong room had been, improbably, the thing that saved her, not from her husband alone, but from the long, slow erosion of herself, from the woman who had been quietly disappearing beneath the weight of a marriage that was, in truth, never a marriage at all. Edmund's hand was warm over hers. He had not let go since he reached for it 2 hours ago, tentatively, as though it were something offered rather than taken. She had let him keep it. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, nothing was locked. Spring arrived at Bath the way good things often do, quietly, without announcement, as though it had always intended to stay.
The garden Cecily had looked at all winter through frost-edged glass was, as she had suspected, lovely. Roses along the south wall, a pear tree old enough to have opinions, beds of lavender that smelled on warm afternoons like something she did not yet have a word for, only the feeling of it, clean and unhurried, settling into the spaces where old Waite used to live. She was reading in the garden on the afternoon Edmund asked her. He did not make a production of it, that was not his way, and she had come to love that about him, the absence of performance, the directness of a man who had spent too many years watching people say one thing and mean another to have any patience left for pretense. He simply sat beside her, waited until she looked up, and said, "I would like very much to do this for the rest of my life, sit beside you, in gardens, in libraries, on terraces before sunrise when neither of us can sleep." A pause. I recognize it is not the most eloquent proposal ever made. Cecily considered him. The afternoon light was doing something generous to his face, softening the angles, catching the gray just beginning at his temples, illuminating the particular expression he wore only when he had stopped protecting himself from her. "It is the most honest one I have ever received," she said. That, they both agreed, was more than enough. They married in June, small, private, attended by people who were present because they wished to be, rather than because society required them to appear. Edmund held her hand through the whole of it, and when it was done, he looked at her with the quiet, settled certainty of a man who has come home after a very long journey and has no intention of leaving again. The house they chose together had a library, a terrace facing east, and corridors she learned by heart within a fortnight. She never counted the doors. She no longer needed to. If this story held you from the first locked door to the last open one, if you felt every moment Cecily stood her ground and every moment Edmund finally let his down, then this channel is exactly where you belong. We tell stories like this every single week. Stories about love that costs something real, betrayal that cuts clean, and the kind of payback that does not need to be loud to be devastating. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story. And if this one moved you, if it made you feel something you weren't expecting to feel on a Tuesday, drop a comment below and tell us which moment got you. We read every single one. The next story is already waiting, and trust me, you are not ready for it.